Hey, everybody. Welcome to week 93. And we're going to kind of change it up and shift things around a little bit today, because we are going to go deep into some mergers and acquisitions war stories. We got plenty of them. But hopefully the whole purpose of this is not to just go down memory lane and embellish, what we've seen. We've seen some pretty disastrous things, actually, and we've seen some things that work really well. And hopefully the reason that we're sharing all this is to help you avoid some of the same disastrous things that we've seen, because there's a lot of money out there on the sideline chasing deals. We see it every day. And, the best time to start preparing for a deal was 5 years ago. So what do you do if you can't go back five years? Well, we're going to talk about some of those things. So I figured, maybe we'll kick it to Jack first, because he has the cool background. He has the thematic background of war stories. And, you're an M&A attorney. So you might want to preface with some of the things that you've seen, as well as things that people can do. And again, you guys can hit us up on the chat and harass us in the middle of it. That always makes it fun. But then also, if you got questions along the way, we don't want this just to be three talking heads, reminiscing. We'll tell some stories, but if you got questions around specific things, and even if it's off topic from M&A, we'll deal with those things too. So, Jack, you want to jump in?
Yeah.
So
hold on a minute.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. We forgot. Rant was part one, right? Go ahead.
Yeah. No. Actually, I was just rant and then maybe some structure. So rant, which isn't much of a rant really. It's just more, again, speculation of people who are thinking about tax rate changes. My good friend Bill Russell, who runs Lake Norman Chamber of Commerce, anytime I give him a rant about how politicians can't get anything done, he always says, well, we can chew bubble gum and walk at the same time. The answer is no, you can't. It's been proven time and time again that you cannot walk and chew bubble gum at the same time if you are a legislative body. So that's a long way of saying that, again, if you just read the tea leaves on, all this stuff around tax law changes, which would come from the formerly known as the Build Back Better bill. I mean, Supreme Court nominee seems to be priority number one. Voting rights seems to be priority number two. And that just leads me to further believe that it means that anything associated with government stimulus / tax rate changes are probably going to be, last in line, which means probably not at all before the election cycle, because I just don't see how they could get it done. That's my opening tirade / speculation. I was thinking from a structure standpoint, Jack, you can still go first, but it might be helpful to talk, maybe start the conversation with war stories about buy side, and then maybe some more stories about sell side, just from a structure perspective.
Oh, I like that.
Okay. And in anticipation also, to go a little on a side note, that we could spend the entire time talking about the war stories. I just want to give people a few updates on other stuff that has come up over the week briefly. So on Tuesday, and we knew this was coming, but there was the formal withdrawal of the vaccine and testing mandate by the White House, meaning that the Department of Labor, the White House, Department of Labor, OSHA, basically said, okay, we're done with that. And what they're doing is they're encouraging business owners to see the light and go through and do that and do what they need to do with respect to that. As far as ERTC, there have been questions in prior weeks about what's going on with that and will there be more money? And I saw an article that there is discussion at the White House about that, and that one of the organizations I belong to, the International Franchise Association, is very knee deep into all of that, and that the discussion is somewhat focused on restaurants, but then the rebuttal to that is there are other types of industries that have been impacted that need this as well. So let's make it more broad than just restaurants and hospitality. And then the response to that is, well, if we do that, then it needs to be, let's go ahead and focus on industries as kind of patchwork rather than throwing this all out for everyone. So let's focus where the needs really are and what businesses, what in industries have been specifically impacted. So, sorting through all that mess is going to take some time. But other than that, really not a whole lot of discussion that I've seen about money coming out of the federal government into our pockets as business owners or individuals. As a side note, and this is a quick giveaway, whoever can tell me in the next 10 seconds what North Carolina was ranked in as far as the quit rate. I heard this on the news yesterday, and then I found the article. WRAL published it. So within the 10 seconds, if you tell me what number, and I'll give you a hint, we're in the top 20, then you get a Starbucks card. So anyway, that is kind of the current news and current events of things. So moving on to war stories.
The current quit rate.
What we are ranked in all 50 states. What is our ranking for the highest, going from highest to lowest, the quit rate, the great resignation. So yes, employee quit rate. So, well, Carrie's close, but
Carrie,
not yet.
Early bird, she jumped in on 8th.
So, all right. You said you want to start on the buy side of things.
Yeah, so you got to tell us what it is. So nobody got it.
Okay, well, I'll send one to Carrie anyway, because we're actually 9th, which isn't super bad, but I mean, 9 out of all the states, so it's still
50.
pretty high. Yeah, it's still pretty high that we have people that are leaving jobs, which is sort of good for the franchising industry or franchise lawyers, that people are moving towards owning their own business through franchises. So, which is actually happening. All right, so on the buy side of things, we could start out with, and not just a quick kind of legal side of things, is that when you are buying a business, everything needs to be in writing. And I say this because recently on 2 different deals, the same lawyer on the other side, older gentleman, and was like, oh, we'll take care of that. We'll do this. We'll, no problems. That's just the way it gets done. And I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. I appreciate that. And I'm glad that you're going to facilitate that. But we do need to have things in writing in particular. And so we, and it was in between his war stories of how things turn out really well. It was challenging because I was seen as an obstructionist to getting the deal done, when really you want it just to be specifically documented, so there's no questions after the fact. And so kind of going into the next topic, and this is really kind of both sides of it, and I know that Adam has some comments about this as well, which is, let's talk about net working capital and working capital numbers and formulas and things like that. So, from a buyer's perspective, and a buyer that is buying a business and has certain expectations moving forward as to, on day one of owning the business, moving forward and being able to operate the business, having enough cash in the business, so working capital, that there is a certain number. And actually in most cases, the bank, if there's a lender involved, they're going to say, our buyer needs to have a certain amount of net working capital in the business. And you may or may not be able to use some of the loan proceeds as part of that net working capital. But usually it is more so that the business has to have a certain amount of dollars in it. And it doesn't matter if it is, and the banks don't necessarily care if it is seller's money or the seller's business money that's in the account, or if the buyer's bringing in their own money into the business. And so what happens is that, well, how do you determine that net working capital number? And then what are the consequences of missing that mark? And as far as calculations go, we've seen where that it was, well, we all kind of know what it means, and we know that it's about, you know, assets versus liabilities and what cash is left over, and then certain things, this and that. But you really need to, as a buyer, know what that formula is so that it is consistently applied in detail prior to closing, at the closing, and then the true up after closing that usually occurs, to say, okay, we benchmarked it, or it's supposed to be $1 million in working capital, net working capital, and there was only 850. So what happens? Well, how do you determine it was $1 million or 850? Things like recently there was deposits in contracts, but were related to liabilities to complete those projects. And how is that treated? And there was discussion as to whether or not, and within those deposits, there was profit built in theory. So how do you deal with that? How do you allocate that? And there was much discussion about that because there were significant dollars. So to wait till after closing to have that discussion and have that level of detail is problematic for the buyer, for the seller as well, because if the seller has certain ideas about, okay, yeah, I get it, I need to have $1 million in cash in the business when I give it to you, when I sell the equity to you, but you're not counting this as part of that $1 million, then that's a problem, because that is essentially a cut to the net proceeds of the purchase price for the transaction. So that's one thing that I've seen recently, and Adam and I were involved in a transaction. It's been several years now, hard to believe, but had issues with net working capital calculations and what should be on there and what shouldn't be. And you know, fortunate that it was discussed early on sufficiently, but the dispute as to what was included or excluded continued on very close to closing, actually. So anyway, I'll stop there, Adam, if you want to touch on the working capital topic.
Yeah, I definitely, you know, I think that really kind of comes down to on the buy side, you know, and by buy side meaning, like, you know, you're the buyer, you know, just to be clear for the people that aren't, you know, in the know on the terminology. You know, I would say probably the two things, or maybe one thing that I've seen the most often that also happened to a deal that Jack and I were working on that did not close. You know, it's greed on the seller's part, and how greed shows up as it relates back to the working capital calculation, a few other things. How greed shows up is, you know, the seller never goes back and says, well, what am I really putting in my pocket? So what they're really putting in their pocket is a combination of, you know, price, tax treatment, and working capital target. So if they're like, oh yeah, I'll totally agree to, you know, a price of, you know, $1 million, and they have, you know, 500 grand sitting in the bank, and you know, you're counting on some component of that for working capital, and they're thinking, oh, cool, I get to put the $500,000 in the cash that's in the bank in my pocket. Great. You know, or I get to keep the AR, you know, as it's collected. Great. So it's $1 million plus the cash in the AR. And you're thinking, no, it's just $1 million, you know, period. That's a big deal. You know, if you're thinking that the method of the purchase price is going to be an asset-based sale, and they think it's going to be a stock-based sale, you know, and that impacts their tax treatment, the net proceeds that are going to go in their pocket. That's a big deal. So it's really unfortunate that we've had, you know, clients that get pretty far down the road thinking they had signed LOIs, you know, thinking they've got a lot of understanding and alignment with the seller, to find out at the last minute they don't actually have alignment with the seller. So it kind of comes down to, you know, if I was to give one piece of advice, I mean, we've said it over and over again. It's like, look, until you've got alignment with the seller on the net cash after it's all said and done, that they're going to put in their pocket, subject to some due diligence, then you don't have a deal. So before I wasted a lot of money on advisors, I think, for us, it's pretty easy because the only thing we're really buying are other CPA firms, or related businesses. So it's kind of simple for us to go through that. But like, if I'm buying a company, I think if I had to do it over again, I would say, until I see something back from the seller saying, yes, I agree with the net amount that I'm going to put in my pocket, and I will not, and I agree to these terms, meaning like the tax treatment, and working capital, I don't even know if I go to step 2. Let me dig a little further, because otherwise it's just going to come up again, and you're going to feel like as the buyer, I thought we were clear, you're just trying to extract more money from me, and then the seller is going to have the opposite feeling of that. Well, actually, they'll have the same feeling just from their perspective.
And I would say related to that also is, and it's not purposeful to be deceptive. It's just kind of what happens when you have a business that has maybe it's a husband and wife, or family members, or a short or a small list of owners and investors that are using the corporate bank account, and this is in an S corp, the corporate bank account as their personal savings account. Somewhat maybe kind of academically lazily, but it is, I think, in their minds for legitimate or intentional purposes, so that it's an emergency fund for the business. It's their money because they've paid taxes on it, because they would have had to, because it's an S corp. So they're kind of using it as a retained earnings, just in case rainy day fund for the business, but they haven't pulled that out. So on their financials, they look flush with cash. And if a seller presents that to a buyer, then it's like, as Adam said, it's deceptive, not purposefully deceptive. It's a misrepresentation of what is going on with the business, potentially a misrepresentation as to what the required working capital numbers are, because you have that cash sitting there. So it creates lots of problems. And we've actually had a client that has been on both sides of that. So it is, in the first instance, the client was going to buy a business and was looking at the financials, and it was a related business. So it just seemed kind of like there's something kind of off. And we're talking about it. I said, there's a lot of cash in the bank. And is this a C Corp or an S Corp, or it was an LLC, but it was S Corp tax treatment. And as it turned out, yes, that's what the owner was doing, was he had cash in there, and it was his expectation, unbeknownst to us and to my client, the buyer client, that it was his intention to extract that capital out of the business, beyond actually bringing the bank account to zero. And it was my client's expectation that even though this was an asset deal, that there would be some cash literally in the tills at the retail shops to continue operating. And then, so that got him thinking, okay, what am I doing in my own accounts? And he was also, with some of his businesses, kind of using that as his corporate bank account as the emergency fund. And so he did a little more diligence and made some adjustments and pulled some of that cash out. I don't know if he spent it, but he pulled it out. And really holding it in a savings account is not the best investment, just practically speaking anyway. So lesson learned that is just for both sides, that it creates problems potentially down the road when you're on the sell side or the buy side. So just be aware of that. And it's common practice. It's the attitude is, hey, it's my money. If I put it over here, it doesn't matter, which is essentially true, except when it does matter, when someone's looking at you for an M&A type transaction, or even a lending transaction. A bank's looking at and saying, oh, wait a minute, what do you need our money for? You got all this money in here. Well, it's really my money. And yeah, I was going to go buy a boat with it. And yeah, that the bank's you need to have bought the boat before you go to the bank and ask for a loan. So that's the lesson out of that.
Yeah, I think probably the last one that I'd hit on the buy side, applies kind of the sell side too. But if you're in, like, if it's a business that you're in, like me buying another CPA firm, or manufacturer buying a competitor or whatever. Yeah, I think the other thing that I would say, as much as I hate saying this, financially, they always seem to work out because you're a smart person. You kind of know how to operate the business because you're in it. But very rarely is it easy when the old owner stays in the business for a long period of time. And what I mean by that is, like, everybody's got the best of intentions. Like, hey, of course it's all going to work out. Totally understand. I got a new boss now. I'm going to be good with that. And the answer is, everybody's nodding their head, and then that just does not show up as true. So, they can still be great financial returns. It's not without a cost, it's not without a cost, and it's more of an emotional and a cultural toll. So I really would also say that, no matter what you write into the agreement, I think having some sort of a, right to exit, with or without cause, even if it costs you some money to be able to do that, based on the seller's perception of lost earnings, is a good idea, because then at least you can say, look, if it's not going the way that I wanted, I'm not stuck with this person for, a ridiculous amount of time, as you often see in, kind of employment agreements that exist after the case. I mean, I really think, kind of best practice from what I've seen is that, maybe a year is as long as you really need. Anything beyond a year, you're probably being excessive and shooting yourself in the foot, from that perspective. So that's another one where, kind of negotiating that up front too. Like, if I was to add another term, it would be, how much longer do you want to work here? And making sure you have alignment on that, and having, a couple things that aren't negotiable, kind of that being one of them, which is, hey, 5 years sounds fine, but I'm just going to let you know that if I don't feel like it's working out after a year, we can even agree on some criteria for it not working out. But if it's not working out after a year, I'm not going to suffer for 4 more years, because of it.
So I'm going to jump in on kind of, and I'm going to ask a question to both of you guys about that. And that is, just as you can have concentration risk in clients, right? I mean, I think last week I may have mentioned that I know of a firm that sold to a UK firm, and they had concentration risk with 70% of their billings tied up in this gargantuan client. Well, the company still bought it, but that gargantuan client, unbeknownst to them, is actually leaving them. So transmission's about ready to fall out. Well, there's also concentration risk in management teams or key person or founder, right? So all roads lead to that, or too many roads lead to that. And so, yeah, that sounds great. I'll exit in a year. But what that also means is, if that concentration is so tied to that owner, I would imagine there's got to be a discount on the front end on this thing, Jack, and I'd like you to weigh in on that. But also, how do you mitigate that if you're going into it eyes wide open? How do you mitigate that so that 1 year sayonara, transmission doesn't fall out?
And it's usually a derivative of the team. So it is, as you said, if it's the person at the top of the pyramid, that there's just total or significant material reliance upon that person, and the business cannot function as efficiently or profitably without that person, then that's a problem. Unless it is more of, well, let's learn about how you do things at your shop, but then we're going to integrate that into our shop, and which also is problematic. And I think that's something that we'll probably talk about in a little bit, about cultures and being an issue in transactions. But as far as personnel goes, on the buyer side, if we're buying from, and this happens, you might imagine, where there is maybe an older patriarch or matriarch of the family, and there's a transition. There's been a lack of interest by the likely successors, meaning the children or key employees, maybe not suited for or capable of buying the business. And so you're going externally to find a suitor and to find a buyer. And so the buyer's concern is, yes, can this continue on as an operating business with this person being gone over a period of time? And in the best, and you have to think about it in the best case scenario and in the worst case scenario, which is, best case scenario is, okay, everything is great, there's a smooth transition, and then he gets on his boat and sails into the sunset and everybody's happy. Worst case scenario is that the prior owner can't let go and is very intrusive and is doesn't understand that his role is to be in a consulting mode and not as an owner mode, and it creates problems in moving forward and is obstructive. And then you give him or her notice that, thanks, your services are no longer needed. Yeah, we'll pay you as we said we're going to, but we need you to leave. And that's a really bad situation to be in. So it's a matter of feeling comfortable with the management team, or that your management team can take over those duties. The flip side of that is that as a seller, how comfortable are you in giving a buyer access to your people and letting the cat out of the bag that this is going to be going on? That happened recently in a transaction that we're familiar with, that the buyer wanted access to the seller's employees, it goes both ways. When a buyer wants access to seller employees and the seller says no, I mean, how can you be assured that these people are going to stay on board? And when you have management people that are integral to the continuing operations, because this was a purchase in a different state, that's a problem. And then the flip side is that a seller saying, well, I want assurances that you are going to hire my people, but you can't talk to them yet. We'll let you know when you can talk to them, but you got to promise to hire them at the same rate, or you can give them a bonus or promotion if you want. So, but yes, the point of all this is that there has to be business continuity on day one of new ownership, and not only that you can run the business and the credit card machines are running properly and you have personnel that can staff the stores or whatever it may be, but that you have the management in place to continue moving forward. Either yours that's absorbing it, or you take theirs that is going to continue on. Does that answer that sufficiently?
Yeah, it was good. I was just curious about your perspective on that, Adam.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because we've been in that situation as a company, and I would tend to agree with Jack. It's like when we looped people in ahead of time, it actually had a very positive impact from a cultural perspective, because they felt like they were part of the design and the solution, and they weren't just blindsided and surprised by anything. And I think it's one of those things where, from the seller's perspective, the fear associated with, now my employees know, is kind of a red herring. I mean, at the end of the day, you're kind of fooling yourself. You think that they're not thinking, this guy's kind of old, I wonder what's going to happen around here. It's like, what's going to happen if, it's not like it's the topic of locker room conversation, but I don't think of every day, but I don't think that there's any, in other words, finding out that the company is selling and it doesn't go through, isn't any different from finding out the company is selling and here's your new potential boss. Like whether you give people, 2 or 3 weeks lead time or they have no lead time, the number of people that are going to stick around are the number of people that are going to stick around. Like that's not going to be any, I don't really feel like it's going to be any different. And I could easily make the case that giving them a longer lead time to get to know you is probably more beneficial as the buyer. And the same thing applies from the seller's perspective that, like if these are people that you really cared about and you want them to feel safe and secure in the transaction, springing them on them, versus kind of looping them into the conversation, early on. I mean, I can easily make an argument that looping them into the conversation early on actually shows more respect and could give more impact in terms of, and would give you more transaction security. Hell yeah, you can talk to my people. In fact, I've already told them they can't wait to meet you. How much better is that than, oh man, if they find out that I'm not going to be here, they might all quit. It's like, well, thank you. I'm going to remove that from my value calculation.
Yeah, and it creates suspicion too.
Yeah, like it's hard to like, sell the message of it's a turnkey operation. I'm not needed here at all with, oh, but you can't talk to anybody because they're all going to quit if they find out that like that's not getting out of both sides of your mouth on that one.
I know this is about war stories, but I also want to talk about somebody that's doing it right. And this is like mergers. I wrote a post last night thinking about it. Like, I rarely have seen a merger. Somebody acquired somebody and they're kind of papering it over and calling it a merger. But I won't say who it was, but it was a well-known CEO in town that I got to work for. And he said it was the largest transaction in that industry at the time. Make no mistake, we bought their asses, is what he said verbatim. Well, that resonated within the halls of this company that I worked for, but it was hailed as the merger of equals in the press, everywhere else. And the acquired company felt like, what? I mean, it wasn't truthful. And, and part of that was the press, part of that was their own internal spin, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. But somebody acquired somebody and culture reigns. The ruling culture will reign. But somebody who's actually doing it really well, I think, and you can hear all about it on the Anything But Typical podcast. It's not a plug for that, but Brandon Lindsay of Hoopaw Grading, they have done a number of strategic acquisitions, and I don't even know if they call them mergers, but at the end of the day, whoever they bought is wearing a Hoopaw logo. And so Hoopaw bought them. But what they did is they were strategic in that they were vertically integrated already. They were working together. They had the conversation. They actually saw what it was like working with one another, cultures. They actually test drove the cultural compatibility, and they've been masterful at it. And very few people are very good at that. I mean, quite frankly, most crash and burn. So again, I know it's war stories, and I'll dovetail one more thing, then I'll shut up about culture. But I got to work with Daimler and Chrysler. I was brought in to do their North American brand strategy for the launch of the Sprinter van, which at the time in 2001 could not be badged Mercedes on the outside. You open up the hood and it's a TriStar logo on the engine and everywhere else in that vehicle. But at the time, they had dealer agreements in North America, in the US in particular, that they couldn't do it. So we worked on a brand strategy. And the funny thing is we said, whatever you do not badge it Dodge. You can use it Freightliner, but do not do Dodge. Well, in their infinite wisdom and arrogance, at some point, they did badge it Dodge, and it was not good. but I remember working with the Germans, very precise, very engineer like, and remember working with the Detroit guys, and they were a lot of fun, but it was all about price, drive down the price, cheap components, and I was like, how could you get more oil and water between these two cultures? And I remember being kind of depressed, going, well, I guess you just get so and so big, you slam them together and it works. Well, what was interesting about 4 or 5 years after I was working with them, the thing blew apart, and $27+ billion was blown up. I mean, it was one of the most colossal failures. And Harvard, business reviews done, case studies on it. And it comes down to culture. That's why I'm wearing Casey Crawford's culture t-shirt. So thank you, Casey, at Movement Mortgage. You can't work on it too much, but cultural compatibility just on the front end, if you're not addressing that, you're fooling yourself, because that's the number one thing that I've seen that has blown every big deal or created issues, whether it ended in complete, torching like what happened with Daimler Chrysler. But there's a lot of repercussions that happen with it. So I'm wondering if you guys have any horror stories or war stories where you've seen that, maybe not to the same degree of 27 billion blown up, but I'm curious about you guys.
So I've seen demergers after the fact, like within a year or 18 months, because the cultures didn't fit. In another situation, the management in a potential merger were happy. It's like, everything's great. Oh yeah, it's going to be great. But then when my client got to talk to the next level underneath the C-suite, it's like, these guys are asses. I mean, can we, are they going to continue on with the business after the merger? We'd love to come work for you, but having them in is just poison, because what you're not seeing is how they treat us and how the culture is here, and that it's, do it our way or go get a job elsewhere. And there really wasn't this cohesiveness that was being represented at the upper levels across in the merger talks. And so luckily they found that information out before they got, they were pretty far along when they found it out, because for the reasons we discussed, my client didn't have access to other people. And actually, if I recall correctly, it was by happenstance that someone knew one of those people socially. And then there was this discussion off the books, essentially, probably an unauthorized discussion. And that's how the information came to light. And then it was looked into further as far as, okay, what are your processes and procedures on certain things? And it just, then it was very apparent. And it was interesting how they were easily masked. And then it was a lesson to me to, okay, maybe, coaching clients to ask certain questions earlier on with respect to culture, when, we are focused on legal and, somewhat financial and making sure all the documents merge up and not really getting into those kind of things. But it definitely is a part of my conversations with clients who are buying, but also clients who are selling. It's okay, I understand you owner are going, you're getting your payday and getting out, but what do you have? Do you feel like you have a duty to your employees that have been with you for a couple of decades to put them with a successor employer that is going to treat them well, or do you not care? And I've had clients quite candidly said, hey, look, I like my family, but I like my money more, and they can make their own decisions. They're adults, and which is unfortunate. In most cases, you do have an owner that is concerned and will make sure that his or her people, family, second family, work family, are going to be well taken care of, sometimes to a point where it is, I want to see the employment agreements for my employees that are going to become your employees. And I want to make sure that they are set and that you can't kick them out 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road unless they for cause unless they screw up. So yes, I've seen it go both ways.
What kind of money, like, give me an example of a range of how much money was spent on a demerger, like all the due diligence, all the front end, all the legal stuff, and then having the thing unwound, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, tens of thousands?
I would say it's probably 7 figures because of the extent of the demerger. Because you think about it, once you merge, the merging people and entity, there's onboarding costs. There is, you got to bring them on board to health, all the perks, all those things that go into onboarding one person multiplied by several. You have logistic issues, which is, so, for us, if we were to go through a merger and a demerger, 18 months, after 18 months of time, there would have been integration of those files into our system. There would have been, and warehousing and dealing with sending out letters to clients, to their clients, to say, hey, we're happy to service you. We're moving over to Shoemaker. It's the same people. So that's just by way of example. So you have, it's more costly than you might think of just saying, okay, yeah, we're going to split up and go our own ways. You take your stuff, because their stuff has become the collective stuff. And to unless, I guess maybe not as bad if those bankers' boxes from those files never got opened over those 18 months. But in order to move forward, you have to be ready on day one of the merger to move forward as a joint venture, essentially as a merged entity, and try to remove the us versus them kind of aspect of it, to make sure that the optics are, it's us now. So a lot of expense, I would say. It's more than what people might think.
Plus the human component of it. I mean, think about the trauma that teams have gone through. Just a practical aspect that I experienced firsthand. We did a bunch of acquisitions in this private equity firm that I was in, because we served a very, very, very affluent group of 300 families. And we wanted to add kind of family office, multifamily office kind of feel, very high touch kind of thing. And when we went from a single firm to where we were going to be buying a bunch of firms, I went to the founder and I said, listen, you don't even allow your vice chairman, who had been probably one of the most high integrity people I've ever known, former treasurer of Walmart. You won't even let him have access to your database of all these 300 families. You start acquiring companies, you got high value targets that are all in this. So the cultural compatibility is probably the most critical that I've ever seen anywhere, because you get the wrong group, you've got all of a sudden the fox guarding the hen house, and then you completely obliterate trust. If somebody's going to take advantage of these high value targets, you got a real mess on your hands. And so that's actually what we ended up doing. Is we did cultural compatibility assessments on the front end of every potential acquisition. And we had one that was extremely lucrative. And the CEO at the time, the founder had exited. The CEO was just chomping, licking his chops at this one, was trying to ram it through. But the leadership team said, no, we're going to go through the process. I did a day and a half. And after a day and a half where we did 100 days, like the first 100 days, who's going to occupy what seats? Like, we got into that granular detail, because that's where a lot of stuff kind of like gets glossed over on the front end. Oh, well, yeah, this will be great. We'll be doing this, but specifically who? Because there's one, as somebody said, there's room for one tiger, not two in the valley in an area. So what are you going to do? Well, and then we did a vote, an up or down vote on cultural compatibility, but also, is this going to work? The mechanics were going to work. The numbers looked great. And we said no. And I'm glad we did, because that company ended up blowing up about a year and a half later. There was all kinds of issues there. And then it worked right, but like getting down into a process, do a day and a half with those two leadership teams and map out what's the first 100 days look like, who's occupying what seats, go through your cultural values, look at the compatibility, look at the issues that could arise. It's just a practical way of kind of ferreting that out. And, spending $10,000, $15,000 for a couple of days beats the heck out of hundreds of thousands or millions. The thing blows up. So Adam, I know you've got some stories.
Yeah, I feel like we've hit the cultural thing pretty hard. And I do have a lot of stories, but at the same time, I was also thinking in the interest of time, it might be helpful to switch over to some sell side.
Yeah, go for it.
Sell side ideas. And I think we've already hit a lot on the working capital and kind of stuff like that can get you at the last minute. But I think, probably first and foremost, and I don't really have a way to consider how would you even counter this, but, I'd say at least probably more just to expect that it's coming at some point. Don't be shocked when it does and how you're going to react to it. But I'd say probably shockingly about 25% of the transactions that occur within our client base, including the ones that don't actually go through because of this, last minute fundamental term changes, like reduction in purchase price, increase in the amount of earnout, just fun change in valuation, like fundamental things that you're already down the road, you got a closing date set. And then, something fundamental changes. I mean, I can't really think of a way to do anything about that other than to mentally prepare yourself and then have a really big breakup fee, associated with it or something that reads something like, and if you change the terms materially from this LOI, you're gonna, and I decide to walk away because of it, it's whatever it is. It's like, and a lot of times these are not related to diligence at all. Just somebody somewhere got a little scared for whatever reason. So maybe Jack, you could help us out, on what to do when that happens.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example of like fundamental of one that I really think, deal ended up happening, just to give the listeners kind of context, deal ended up happening, but, had a deal, all cash offer, buyer stalled, because they just could not get their crap together to get the transaction closed. Well, guess what? March 2020 hits. Oh, we're really concerned about the future. Therefore, we want to change the terms of the deal to be more of an earnout model. Okay, that's fine. Well, then what happened? Stalled on the integration. Plus, it's still the middle of a pandemic that lasted longer than anybody could have expected. And, due to some delays, the earnout wasn't hit, so it's like indirectly, 40% reduction in purchase price because the buyer stalled originally. Now the company's back to normal and doing fine. So anywho.
Yeah. So one thing you kind of touched on is the, having your house in order. And one of the things that I see is in the governance document or the relationship between the owners. Now, on the one hand, you have an operating agreement that likely was negotiated between arm's length investors and the majority owners, majority minority. So to the extent that you have, as the majority owner, granted minority owners what I would call interference rights, protection rights, to be able to impose themselves into a transaction, then that's kind of on you. What I'm talking about more so is family-owned businesses or businesses between fraternity brothers, sorority sisters, siblings, whatever it may be, that when you put the business together and put together the operating agreement or the shareholders agreement, and it is, okay, yeah, mom and dad are the majority owners, and then you have kids, and let's assume that they are of the age of majority, so they're over 21, that are given minority interest because it's not necessarily a family business, but you feel like that the parents feel like that is part of their the inheritance of the kids. And then as time goes on, there was nothing really addressing, or even there was a prohibition against the mom and dad making a decision. And it was maybe an operating agreement that was thrown in front of them that basically said you have to have unanimous consent for any type of transaction, transfer of equity. That is the worst case you can be in as the majority owner, which is basically you've given others, and presumably the others you've given a minority interest to are going to do whatever mom and dad say, literally and figuratively. And as it turns out, didn't turn out that way. So you have a governance issue that is allowing someone, and let's say that there's a falling out between the individuals, between the kids, one of the kids. And so you want to have in your governance documents the ability typically of the majority to drag the minority along for a transaction. And I see that being, kind of, as Adam said, maybe a surprise later on in the process where the patriarch and matriarch assume that, oh yeah, the kids will come along. It is a gift to them. They're going to get their money cashed out. And now all of a sudden you have a problem because they can't sell the business. So you need to be careful with having your ducks in a row, that that the transaction can happen, that you can cause the transaction to happen as a seller. Relatedly, in talking about deadlines and remorse, on letters of intent, when you put a deadline in there, it means what it means, unless you are clarifying it. Don't assume that. So for example, there's kind of a tenement of law in litigation that if a deadline falls on a holiday or weekend, it goes to the next business day, generally speaking, okay? However, in the rest of the world, in meaning business world, deadline, that is not a valid presumption. So if you put a deadline, like you decide, well, yeah, July 31st sounds good, and it falls on a Sunday, and you do not provide notice, and it says by 5 p.m. on the due diligence deadline that you have for no reason at all to be able to get out of this transaction, or you lose your $50,000 deposit, and you don't send that termination by 5 p.m. on a Sunday thinking, I got until tomorrow because no one works on a Sunday, that's a problem. So be aware of deadlines that can be strictly construed. I've had clients that have lost deposits. I have had clients that have enforced the forfeiture of deposits based upon the strict interpretation of the language. And in one instance was able to get around that because it said when the notice is sent, and through metadata on the DocuSign, we were able to show that it actually was launched at 4:58 p.m. And even though it was received at 5:01, if it had said received or it was silent, it was when notice is provided. Is it sent? Is it received? So the client got lucky in this instance that it was specific that when notice is sent, it is deemed terminated, and it was sent at 4:58 p.m. So don't put yourself in that very stressful situation. So be aware of that as well.
I like your notion, and maybe it's more prevalent than what I've seen, Adam, but of having a substantial buyer's remorse, or I'm going to drag my feet fee. I'm on the board of a company where we anticipated having a transaction done before the end of the year. The seller really has no options for a number of reasons. It makes tremendous sense from the seller standpoint. Their employees are going to remain intact. is a good way for this person to exit into the sunset. There's all kinds of good things, but I'm not sure that they actually had a, consequence, a financial consequence, that if you drug your feet on it, and maybe, some of these smaller deals, that happens more often than not. I don't know, but when you're buying a house, you put down earnest money and it's gone if you back out, so how many times, I'm just curious, Jack, from the legal side, how often do you see deals that they failed to do that?
So a lot of times it's a version of that. So a lot of times, similar to maybe a residential commercial real estate transaction, where it is, okay, the document is signed, and then you get 30 days or so, 60, 90 days, whatever it may be, to do the due diligence. There's money that is put into deposit into an escrow, and then and to my example, if it had not been before 5 o'clock, then my buyer client would have lost that money. And so that is ultimately kind of like the trump card that a buyer has typically in those situations. Now, to your point, there are situations where a buyer will be insistent upon what's called a breakup fee. It's typically called a breakup fee. So it is money that the seller, that they've gotten to a point where it's, and this happens typically on larger transactions, but you can have a variation of this because the concept and the purposes are kind of transaction value agnostic, essentially, which means that when you sign up a transaction and then you have the buyer going through due diligence, there's expenses that are incurred. And in a larger deal, it may be a team of CPAs, it may be a team of lawyers, it may be different teams of lawyers, environmental, real estate, employment. So you have deployed all of these assets, which cost money. And then if but it's based upon a deal that is really kind of mentally, psychologically progressed beyond a simple LOI. And so it is, the attitude is, unless there's something really, really, really wrong, then you sellers shouldn't be able to get off the hook on this. And if you decide to do, you're going to pay us a lot of money as kind of a fee to get out of this. And it could be that it is what I would call a constructive or productive breakup, which is we're willing to pay the bounty on the breakup because something has happened that is going to increase the value of the business. So we're going to give them that money and we're going to walk away from the deal because we know within 12 months, we're going to have a different deal that has increased the purchase price. Now, a assertive buyer would say, and even if you pay us those fees, you can't enter into a transaction for a certain period of time. Sellers usually aren't going to go, they're like, look, we'll pay you the money, but to cover your costs, but we like this other deal better. So we're going to go over here. We'll give you your money, sorry for wasting your time, but we're going to cover your costs and more. And that's how that typically works. So that is what a typical breakup fee, we've heard that term, but for people that are watching, typically that's what that's for. But the JV or junior version of that is to have an escrow that after a period of time becomes non-refundable and is essentially applied to the purchase price. And as would a funded breakup fee, those dollars would then be put into the transaction as part of the purchase proceeds.
Well, we've already hit 1 hour and it feels like we just barely scratched the surface. And we didn't have any questions. I'm so bummed about that. But my feeling is we may have to do a series of these. and because again, it'd be one thing if there were no transactions going on out there and it was dead, but there's a lot. And I hear it frequently, you guys do too, I'm considering, there's some crazy money getting thrown at me, or, hey, I'm seeing what my buddy just did. I want to do that too. But I think some of the other things that I think that we need to dive into in another subsequent series would be, or another episode of this would be, what are the things that you got to do proactively to be prepared so that you, on both sides, but especially on the, I want to get the most value for my company, et cetera. I think there's some things that we could go deep on that. I know that Adam does that a lot with our clients. Thoughts about that?
Well, I would say that, I mean, what's interesting about that whole thing is that it also applies to operational businesses and just cleaning them up in general. So
heck yeah.
And you've done this as well, which is you do go through the cleanup and then it's like, I'm going to stick around for a little while longer. I like the new us. So I'm going to continue doing, I'm off the market. Thank you so much for helping us do that.
Yeah.
And so what you've done is you've made them more valuable in the event that they want to sell down the road. And I think provided them with opportunities for expansion, potentially opportunity, whether it is through private equity, whether through traditional lending, and a lot of times it is, we talked about culture, that the culture is better. So you have increased the efficiency of your business by going through that process. But yeah, there's certainly in that process, there's low-hanging fruit that is, okay, yeah, you can change that pretty easily and inexpensively, and just, it's like, why didn't I think of that before? And then there's others that you need to dive deeper into and say, okay, let's talk about this. Why one of the biggest things, one of the biggest topics that I have, or I guess prevalent topics is, in talking to an owner is, so you're at the office doing the work, but when you started this business, what were you doing? Well, I was out there selling. And like, okay, why aren't you out there doing it now? Well, because someone needs to be back at the office, working at the office. I'm like, you can hire someone to do that. You need to maximize what you are able to do and what your most beneficial role in this company is. And it's obviously out there meeting people because you're extroverted, people like you, and you can have people in the back office that you pay to run your QuickBooks. You don't need to be running QuickBooks yourself. So it's things like that we see, and I know you guys see over and over again. It's like, okay, why? Well, that's just how the business evolved over the course of time. And, they never made a change back to what made them successful to begin with.
You like that idea, Adam?
I do. As I said, we've been thinking about trying to, hey, what do we start talking about, after this? So I definitely like the idea of just keeping this as a theme, because it's, for us, we go through this every day, but for our clients, we, it's something they're only going to do once or twice, hopefully in their lifetime. So there you go.
Yeah. So I stay tuned. Something along this line of bulletproofing for value, I think resonates. Yes, this was recorded, David. Cool. Yeah. I want to watch this through again before asking a dumb question. No question is dumb. We will not make you feel stupid. But David, thanks for that. Yeah, this will be put up on the BGW CPA YouTube channel this afternoon, and you guys can go back and review that. And then let's plan on next week. We'll continue on this theme, but go more specifically on bulletproofing for value, that kind of thing. So any parting thoughts, Jack or Adam?
No, I don't have anything. I just appreciate everybody. Sorry, I appreciate everybody's time. Do it on mute there for a second so you can hear the dog bark.
Yeah, I have a dog in the background with a squeaky ball that you can't hear. But so yes, and to reiterate Gary's comment, there's no dumb question. You'd be surprised. It's on other people's minds as well. It just, maybe you have the bravery to actually articulate it, which is totally fine. So, but yeah, I like the idea of going through the whole bulletproofing. I like that. So that's what we'll do.
Sounds great. Everybody have a wonderful day. It's beautiful out there. Get outside and enjoy some sunshine, vitamin D. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day. See y'all.